The year is unknown. The world is left a barren wasteland, with mankind having long since abandoned it, as humanity fled to the stars, with any stragglers sure to have died in the wake of an undisclosed but harrowing disaster, the details of which are only hinted at. Years later, an intentional sabotage of one of the few functioning electrical systems left in place leads it to malfunction, unleashing a range of powerful creatures with forms and abilities totally unlike our own to take over the land and reclaim it for their own. It's easy to hear this description and think it's the premise of a horror movie, because it sort of is. But this is indeed the story of the latest Pokémon game, as Pokémon Pokopia provides a fair few unique story twists throughout its narrative. The team involved with Pokopia did a truly impressive job of not just making the game involving our jolly little jelly-like friend Ditto into perhaps one of the most addictive substances known to man, but also for walking a careful line with the game, in terms of it being a Pokémon game effectively set in a dystopia that is emphasised by just about every journal and document you read throughout the game, and it being one of the more cheerful and chirpy Pokémon games thus far at the same time, since it's all about helping your Pokémon pals out and banding together to make the world a better place for each other, and to make it a livable place for humanity should they return. Though this plotline might seem somewhat jarring because of its duality, it's one that feels particularly fitting both because of the way Pokémon has always operated as a franchise, and because Pokopia sees you very specifically play as a creature that is effectively what would have happened if the monster from The Thing was a chill guy instead of a bloodthirsty extraterrestrial. There's a reason that one theory that Dittos are clones of Mew was so popular for a good while on the internet, and that's that Ditto is just very weird. And I say this as someone whose favourite Pokémon is the wacky little grinning shapeshifter, and is a proud member of the Ditto Appreciation Society. They're established as Pokémon that can pretty much rewrite their own cellular structure to whatever is around them, even legendary Pokémon, which means they can effectively be as strong as God in universe. But they're also canonically made out to be largely silly little guys despite the staggering power and potential, to the point that one of their main weaknesses is being made to laugh, which Pokémon Scarlet's Pokédex entry for Ditto states will see it return to its original form. Given you spend all of Pokopia seeing just how potent Ditto's abilities are, it wouldn't have taken much for a lesser version of the game to accidentally depict our endearing, grinning protagonist as an entity that simply didn't need humanity, and that might arguably be better off without people to command it around. Instead, though, a core concept of Pokopia is that our Ditto misses their trainer dearly, and this humanises a character who could have otherwise seemed less a figure with a personality and hopes and dreams, and seemed more like a playable Swiss Army knife who we can use to cure all the world's ills thanks to the roughly 700 superpowers they take on throughout the course of our adventures. With this in mind, Pokopia's ending, wherein you manage to totally accidentally send off Team Rocket's rocket, which is shown delving into space and then seemingly arriving at Ditto's trainer's home in outer space, who sees the picture Ditto took that is with said rocket, feels entirely fitting. It doesn't outright state everything will go back to normal and humanity will return to the planet. And indeed, I think it's still possible humanity doesn't manage to do this, and that the theories this game is the midpoint between the main games and the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games are right. But we do know said trainer ends up with some evidence that the world they left behind has become habitable again, and we are explicitly told there's enough fuel in the Team Rocket ship for a return trip back home. So it's an ending that leaves the door open for you to feel hopeful, but doesn't undo all the darker elements of the game by simply saying, yeah, the dystopia is over, gang, everything is back to normal, apocalypse who? Perhaps the thing I like about this approach the most is how it reflects an aspect of Pokémon that has literally always been there in some form or another, as the series has always blended the line between being fully cheerful and having some darker moments, plot points, and aspects of its lore. To some degree, this is arguably a famous part of the franchise, really, since things like Drifloon kidnapping children, or, you know, the Pokémon that are just dead people, or Pokémon, aren't exactly unheard of, and are common points of fan discussion, even if that conversation tends to simply be people having the same understandable reaction of saying, wait, what? A million billion times. While the focus of the Pokémon games have always been to show the benefits of humans and Pokémon working together, and to show how a healthy, positive bond between trainer and Pokémon where both parties trust and believe in one another can effectively do the impossible, there's no shortage of things like brutal Pokémon wars, or harrowing criminal enterprises that kidnap and torment creatures who are oftentimes people's family members. This is given some more direct focus in the series' stories, via moments like the reveal Team Rocket is taking in selling Slowpoke tales in the Johto region stories, or basically anything about Getsis and his plan to become the world's dictator via ensuring he was the only person with Pokémon. With that said, I think the stories of so many Pokémon games work because of these darker aspects of their stories, which add not only stakes, but also serve as proof that the endeavours of our protagonists and the franchise's heroes to look after the world and those within it are both needed, and are the main thing that keeps the franchise from delving into grim-dark territory overall. In this way, Pokemon Pokopia ends up being more like Pokemon Colosseum than the likes of Animal Crossing in a lot of senses, most clearly in this ending, and the scenario it ends the story of Pokopia in overall. To sum things up briefly, Colosseum's story focuses around one of the darkest concepts in the franchise game-wise, that being the idea that Pokemon have been artificially turned into shadow Pokemon, who've had their minds and souls warped, transforming them into entities who can't feel positive emotion or grow unless this status is cured. However, this makes it all the more impactful to help these Pokemon out, and to feel like the plot of the game is you rehabilitating and caring for these creatures who otherwise would have existed in a truly cruel state. Versus how the main games can sometimes feel a little like you maybe just kidnapped a member of a Pokemon family, in order to give them a personal Rocky montage as part of your team. Pokopia works in much the same vein, and may arguably do an even better job of conveying this idea universally. Rehabilitating the abandoned areas of Kanto that you do throughout the game feels as satisfying as it does, in part because we know Ditto's unique copycat abilities make us able to help the rest of the Pokemon world in a way no other creature really can. And also because we know all these Pokemon, even after all the confusion and distress they've faced from being parted with their lives and the humans within them beforehand, ultimately just want to help restore the world, live good lives, and set things up so that if any people do return, they'll return to the best scenario possible. I would love to say this idea didn't make me tear up more than once as a grown adult, but I would surely be lying to do so. Because it's worth keeping in mind that these Pokemon don't appear to understand what's happened, even by Pokopia's ending, despite the lore books we read throughout the game. Even Mewtwo seems pretty unclear about what happened to humanity, and though we know contextually that the rocket that's been sent off is seen by a human and opens the potential for humanity to return to the planet, I get the impression the characters in-universe are basically left in the dark. Though please let me know in the comments if I've missed something in this regard, as I've not yet 100%ed the game, and it would warm my heart immensely to know our crew get a sneaky update from, like, Jirachi or something. That said, I think it's in some ways more heartwarming for the Pokemon in Pokopia to be doing the work they are, to try and rebuild the world and adorn it with human artifacts in the hopes they may be reunited with their human friends and loved ones, despite them having zero idea what happened and whether it could ever go back to normal. There's a consistent faith expressed by the characters in the game, who don't ever seem to truly consider that humanity abandoned them, even though they maybe slightly kinda did. And that bond between mankind and their funky, otherworldly counterparts is so long-lasting and pure that, even in a scenario where it'd be very reasonable for these connections to dissolve, they're shown to be stronger than ever, to the point that Ditto spends the entire game copying the look of their trainer, and will only change this look to take on the outfits of other notable humans that it presumably liked the vibes of. More emotional still, we see clear evidence that these Pokemon are right to have this faith in many ways. The hacker whose diary reveals a lot about what happened before the events of Pokopia's story itself also reveals they hacked the PC system to make sure that the Pokemon within it would be freed when the planet reached a state where Pokemon could live on it, to ensure they weren't trapped in a virtual realm forever if humankind didn't return. Similarly, though it initially seems like Professor Tangrowth may have just been outright ditched, since he seems to have been around way before everyone else, we learn he was the beloved family member of a professor, and only was out and about before everyone else because he ran away from the Pokemon conservation project intended to hold these Pokemon to try and find his family. Better still, we also hear the human professor who adopted Tangrowth as a Tangler is so moved by this that they decide to try and return to the planet with humanity's research teams as soon as possible, so they can find their beloved companion. Given the professor accidentally bonds with Tangler in the first place, this feels kind of like the Pokemon equivalent of how the person in a family who is the least interested in adopting a cat or dog often ends up being the person who connects with them and loves them the most in the end. which means it's hard to not have your heart soften when you hear the storyline. With all this in mind, I think anything short of the story or ending that we got would have been either overselling the cheerful, child-friendly aspects of Pokemon, or otherwise making its most cozy-feeling game into berserk for no good reason. Though it's an ending that's sure to have made a lot of people tear up, and that I had a completely normal and totally not emotional response to, thank you very much. The idea that, even when they're light years apart, people in Pokemon are always trying to look out for one another is something that can make even an apocalypse and its initially dystopian after effects into something that's downright relaxing, and into a situation where your worst stress is trying to work out how to make someone's fully furnished home more or less humid, which is a pretty massive win in my book. If you've gotten to this part of the video, firstly, a colossal thanks, as always, for testing your attention span with my nonsense. And secondly, I hope you've enjoyed either playing Pokopia or seeing all the cool stuff people have covered and made about the game as much as I have. Because this video is no doubt going to be at least 2 days later than I've intended, because I am consistently distracted right now with all the neat stuff folks have made in-game. Thirdly, and most importantly though, I hope whenever you watch this you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, and that any dystopia you may get stuck in has a friendly Ditto to save the entire world, and painstakingly build you the house of your dreams along the way, as it's the least you deserve in my entirely humble and not at all biased opinion.